I didn't know it then, on that quiet Christmas morning, when the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and burnt coffee, and the light above us hummed with that familiar, comforting buzz. He slid a stack of papers across the table, smiling in that easy, practiced way that made everything feel harmless. "Just technical paperwork," he said. "Something to help us qualify for tuition aid. It doesn't change anything between us." And I believed him, because when you share a home, a hope, a history, you forget that paper can be weaponized, that trust can be twisted into a trap, so silent you don't hear it close. It wasn't until weeks later, when a letter arrived confirming my single status, that the truth began to lift its head. Not with drama, not with shouting, just a sentence printed in cold ink, delivered by a mail carrier who had no idea he was handing me the first crack in my marriage. Every discovery after that came quietly. The forged forms, the metadata, the hidden submissions. Each one a piece of a story I didn't know I was living, until I became the one documenting it. This is not a tale of rage or revenge. It's a story of precision, of reclaiming the truth inch by inch, of standing in a courthouse hallway with documents in my hands and realizing, he faked the papers. I made them real. If you want to follow more stories told with honesty, heart, and a cinematic eye on real human moments, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. It was Christmas morning when he slid the stack of temporary aid paperwork across the kitchen table, the pages still warm from the printer. The smell of coffee drifted into the thin lines of ink like it was trying to soften them. Our kitchen light hummed above us, familiar, steady, almost too ordinary for something that could shift a life's direction by a few inches. He positioned the papers right in front of me, clearing his throat as if rehearsing a tone that sounded both casual and urgent. I remember the soft rustle of the pages when he nudged them closer, the faint smudge of toner on the corner. Nothing about the moment felt dramatic. It felt domestic, quiet, absolutely disarming. He told me it was just temporary, a technical maneuver to qualify for tuition assistance, something about income thresholds and timing windows. His voice had the patient lift people use when they want you to trust them without asking too many questions. "We're still married," he said, almost laughing. "This is just paperwork." I watched him lean back, confident I would agree, like we were aligning schedules instead of redefining a legal state. He framed it as harmless, bureaucratic, routine. And because he smiled like he believed it, I let my shoulders fall, as if the decision needed only the weight of his reassurance. The pages waited between us, quiet, expectant. When I picked up the pen, my hand didn't shake. Not because I understood the forms, but because I trusted the man across from me more than the words printed on those lines. I didn't analyze the clauses, or trace the margins with suspicion. I simply signed where he tapped. I thought love allowed you to lean on someone else's summary of the fine print. I thought marriage meant certain shortcuts were safe. My name moved across the page the way it always had, steady, habitual, loyal. I didn't look up after the final stroke. I didn't need to. Trust can be a blinding light when you believe it's warm. He gathered the papers with a quick, practiced sweep and slid them into our shared brown folder, the one we used for taxes, car titles, the mundane artifacts of adulthood. I saw his fingerprint smudge briefly along the plastic edge as he pressed the folder shut. There was something almost careful in the way he handled it, like the pages were more valuable than he pretended. He tucked the folder under his arm, humming a tune he never finished, and walked toward the hallway. I watched him go, the kitchen light catching on the plastic cover as he turned. Nothing in his movement suggested deceit. That, I would learn later, is how deceit works best. I placed the remaining documents back into the second drawer of our filing cabinet, the one that always stuck for half a second before opening. When it finally gave way, the metal rails let out a short, familiar catch, almost like a quiet warning I didn't know how to interpret. I set the folder inside, smoothing the edges so it lay flat. The sound of the drawer sliding shut felt heavier than usual, as though something more than paper had just been stored away. But life is full of small sounds you learn to ignore, especially in a home where routine feels like safety. I let the drawer close without a second thought. As I turned off the kitchen lights, the porch lamp flicked once. Just a thin blade of brightness slipping across the counter, catching on the ink of my signature before disappearing. It was brief, almost imperceptible, like a breath clearing its throat. I didn't read anything into it then. I just stood there for a moment, hand on the switch, unaware that the smallest glint of light had just whispered the first warning. Some truths arrive quietly, long before we're ready to recognize them. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked upright in the mailbox, as if someone had placed it there with deliberate care. The seal was thick, embossed, and unmistakably official. When I brought it inside, the corner brushed against my porcelain cup, leaving a tiny crescent of moisture on the red postage stamp. I opened it at the kitchen table, the paper stiff and cold against my fingers. The words were clean, printed with bureaucratic certainty. A certified confirmation of my single status. I read it twice, not because I doubted the sentence, but because my mind needed a second to catch up to the logic. Paper rarely lies. People often do. I asked him about it that evening, holding the letter by its edge so the language didn't accidentally claim me. He glanced at it with the same ease someone gives a receipt they don't intend to keep. They must have made a mistake, he said, soft and sweet, like calming a child after a storm. He even laughed a little, as if the whole thing were mildly amusing. The light above us buzzed quietly, and his shadow drifted across the floor in a long, unbroken line. He spoke with such gentleness that, for a moment, I almost felt impolite for questioning it. But the letter's weight still pressed against my palm, steady and undeniable. I didn't argue. I took a photo instead, angled, clear, time-stamped, and saved it in a hidden folder on my phone. I named the file with the exact date and hour, a habit born less from suspicion than from a need to organize confusion into something orderly. Then I placed the letter face down on the table and sat with it for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around me. My phone screen dimmed, then darkened completely, leaving only my reflection for a second. Evidence, I was beginning to learn, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to exist. That night he slept soundly, his breathing even and slow, the kind of rest that comes easily to someone convinced everything is under control. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing faint lines in the paint with my eyes, counting the rhythm of his breaths like an unwilling lullaby. My phone lit up once with a soft blue glow, the photo of the letter resting in its secret folder, waiting. I didn't reach for it. I simply watched the light fade, and when darkness returned, it felt more honest than anything spoken that day. In the morning, I folded the letter along its factory crease and slipped it into my small notebook, the one thin enough to disappear inside any bag, the kind you carry for reasons you can't yet articulate. I wrote a short line beneath it. Verify at County Clerk. The ink bled slightly into the page, a quiet reminder that thoughts are easier to record than feelings. I closed the notebook and placed it gently beside my keys. Plans, I was beginning to understand, don't have to be loud to be firm. I didn't confront him again, not yet. I made a choice instead, to believe the document until proven otherwise. Not out of cynicism, but because facts hold a steadiness his words no longer did. I told myself I would wait, watch, and gather. Truth, when handled carefully, has its own gravity, and I could feel it starting to pull. The county clerk's office was colder than I expected.
the kind of cold that settles into your fingertips no matter how tightly you hold your bag. When I handed over the letter and asked for clarification, the clerk scanned the barcode, tapped a few keys, and tilted her head. She printed something without looking at me, the machine spitting out a sheet of paper with a faint chemical smell. When she finally faced me, her expression was neutral, professional, almost apologetic in its detachment. "Your divorce file is active," she said. The stamp on the corner was still warm when she slid it across the counter. The paper felt rough, not like something newly created, but something recently handled. My eyes followed the date. It matched Christmas. My hand stayed steady, the rest of me didn't. She pointed to the filing number, tapping twice as if guiding me through a map I hadn't realized I was already walking. The date of submission was printed in clean, emotionless ink. I repeated it silently, matching it to the night he'd asked for my signature. The clerk waited for questions I couldn't manage to form. Outside, through the wide glass, the morning traffic crawled along, normal, steady, indifferent. I thanked her with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. She nodded once, already turning to the next task. Bureaucracy has a way of moving on quickly, even when you haven't. I folded the document with careful precision, as if neatness could offer meaning. Before leaving, I requested 2 certified copies, the kind sealed in stiff brown envelopes that resist bending. The clerk stamped each one with a decisive thud, the ink bleeding slightly into the fibers. I watched her slide them into reinforced folders and seal the edges with practiced motions. They felt heavier than paper when she handed them to me, as though weight could be assigned by truth alone. I placed one in my bag and carried the other in my hand, gripping it harder than necessary. On the sidewalk outside, I stood still for a moment, feeling the city move around me. Car horns, footsteps, distant laughter, all sounding too alive for what I held. At home, he claimed it was a system glitch, something clerical, something that happens all the time. His tone was soft, rehearsed, patient. I let him talk while I set my keys on the counter, listening to the way his explanations bent around details he never addressed. The sealed envelope in my hand felt like an anchor, pulling my thoughts back to the clerk's calm certainty. I didn't challenge him. I didn't need to. His words floated untethered, while the facts in my bag sat solid and heavy. For the first time, I understood that silence could be a form of strength rather than surrender. That night, I opened my laptop and created a new document labeled Evidence Ledger, a name that felt both clinical and strangely comforting. I began logging everything: the certified copies, the receipt from the clerk's office, the exact timestamps of every conversation. I typed slowly, deliberately, making each line as clear as the documents I was collecting. Logic steadied me. Order steadied me. I attached images, saved PDFs, and cross-referenced every detail with its source. The ledger began to take shape, neat and structured, something that belonged entirely to me. When I closed the file, I felt the faintest shift inside, as if a new foundation had been poured. Before going to bed, I changed the password on my computer, choosing a string of characters with no sentimental meaning, nothing tied to anniversaries or dates that once mattered. I saved the ledger to a small silver USB drive and slid it into a drawer he never used. The click of the drawer felt final, like sealing a box you no longer intend to reopen. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without feeling something catch in my chest. Truth, once acknowledged, doesn't comfort you right away, but it does begin to hold you upright. The attorney I met with didn't try to soften anything. He sat across from me in a quiet office that smelled faintly of old books and printer toner. His fingers steepled as he reviewed the documents I laid out. When he spoke, his tone was even and unhurried, the calm of someone who has seen every version of a story like mine. "Don't confront him yet," he said. "Gather more. Pattern matters."
His eyes stayed on the papers, tracing the dates, the stamps, the sequence only facts can create. I watched his pen pause above a margin, absorbing his instruction. His steadiness didn't comfort me in the emotional sense. It grounded me in the practical one. I left the office with a quiet resolve tucked under my coat, sharper than fear, stronger than anger. At home, I opened every account, subscription, and automated system tied to our shared life. I didn't change anything yet. I simply observed. I built folders inside folders,
Forwarding copies of billing notices to an unused secondary email I'd created years ago. Each alert arriving in that silent inbox felt like a small signal from a world I was now watching from above, rather than living inside. I traced payment histories, archived statements, and flagged any charge that didn't align with the explanations he'd given me in passing. There was an odd calm in the process, the kind that comes when numbers speak more clearly than people. Monitoring became less about suspicion and more about clarity. He noticed my quiet before he noticed anything else. One evening, as I wiped down the counter, he leaned against the doorway and asked if something was wrong. His voice carried a practiced softness, the kind used to coax answers he already expected. I told him I was just tired from work, keeping my back turned long enough for him to accept it. He stepped into the kitchen, searching my face for signs of irritation or accusation. I offered none. There is a way to be silent that leaves no foothold for argument, and I had grown fluent in it. His questions faded quickly, almost too quickly, as if my calm unsettled him more than my concern ever had. Later that night, the kitchen faucet began to drip, slow, measured drops that echoed through the room like a metronome. I sat at the table with the lights dimmed, letting each drop punctuate my thoughts. The rhythm was steady, unvarying, and strangely soothing. I counted the intervals without meaning to, as though the water was marking time for me. It felt appropriate. The leak was small, ignorable to anyone not listening closely, but persistent enough to signal something beneath the surface. I didn't fix it. Not yet. Some problems reveal more when allowed to repeat themselves. I closed my notebook and wiped down a glass just to keep my hands busy, the cloth moving in small, deliberate circles. Small tasks became anchors, a way to stay outwardly composed while my mind cataloged every inconsistency he'd ever brushed aside. I watched the kitchen light glint across the rim of the clean glass before setting it gently on the counter. These motions, quiet and controlled, felt like rehearsals for the steadiness I would need. I wasn't pretending to be calm. I was building it. That night, I made a decision as simple as closing a door. I would no longer ask him anything. I would only record. Questions invite performances. Documentation reveals patterns. There was power in letting silence hold the space where confrontation used to live. As I turned off the kitchen light, the room settled into stillness. A stillness I finally felt aligned with. Whatever was coming, I would meet it with clarity, not noise. I heard the conversation by accident, or at least that's what I told myself as I paused in the hallway, a grocery bag still in my hands. His voice drifted from the living room, low, confident, almost rehearsed. "She doesn't suspect a thing," he said, the words slipping out with the ease of someone narrating a play they'd memorized. I froze. Not because of the meaning, but because of the tone. A certainty built on the assumption that I wasn't paying attention. The person on the other end murmured something I couldn't make out, and he laughed, soft and pleased. There was a comfort in his voice I hadn't heard directed at me in months. I stood there long enough to feel the bag handles bite into my fingers before I finally set them down. My phone buzzed lightly in my pocket, recording automatically because I'd enabled the feature weeks ago on a quiet instinct I never admitted to myself. The device hummed against my leg, then settled. I didn't reach for it until the house fell silent again. By then the recording was saved, named with a string of numbers marking time the way truth often does. Clinically, without sentiment. I sat at the edge of the bed, listening through earbuds, letting his voice repeat in a loop that sounded more like a script than a conversation. Each repetition stripped away another layer of doubt. Patterns, once heard clearly, can't be unheard. I exported the audio file, saved it to my ledger, and created a checksum note for its timestamp. The digital structure of it, clean folders, precise labels, felt steadier than anything unfolding in the real world. I added an index number, watched it fall neatly into place between earlier entries, and felt the strange satisfaction of things aligning. Documentation didn't soothe me emotionally, but it anchored me logically. The more I organized, the less chaotic everything felt. I could almost imagine the ledger as a quiet room where truth stacked itself in orderly shelves, waiting for its moment. When he finally emerged from the living room, he told me he'd been talking to the financial aid office, trying to clear up confusion. His tone was breezy, practiced, shaped into something friendly. I nodded without asking for details, opening my laptop as if I were simply checking email. I let his explanation hang in the air, untouched. The absence of interrogation unsettled him more than any challenge could have. He lingered near the doorway, searching my face for the reaction he expected. I offered none. Silence, I'd learned, leaves no handholds. Later, I realized my understanding of trust had shifted. I no longer measured it by the warmth of his voice or the softness of his reassurances. I measured it by the logs, the metadata, the details that didn't waver when pressed. It was odd, freeing almost, to stop expecting truth to sound gentle. I scrolled through the ledger, reviewing entries with a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. My breathing found a slow, even rhythm, matching the quiet order on the screen. I didn't feel angry. I felt accurate. One boundary crystallized without ceremony. I would not argue with him anymore. Arguments rely on shared reality. We no longer inhabited the same one. Evidence doesn't debate. It documents. It endures. It waits. And now, so would I. As I powered down the laptop, the room felt unusually still, as if something important had shifted but hadn't yet announced itself. I closed the lid gently, almost ceremonially, knowing the next phase would arrive on its own timing. The document slipped out of the filing drawer on a Thursday afternoon, landing face up on the hardwood with a light, papery sigh. I hadn't pulled the drawer hard, just enough for the rails to catch the way they always did. But something inside shifted, releasing a single sheet, as though it had been waiting for the right moment. The room was bright, the late sun angling through the window and brushing a thin line of light across the signature I recognized instantly as my own. I stood still for a few seconds, the kind of stillness that comes when your body registers the meaning before your mind fully catches up. Then I crouched to pick it up, fingers grazing the roughness of its edge. When I held it, the familiar scent of old ink rose faintly, carrying me back to that Christmas night. The hum of the kitchen light, the steady warmth of the coffee mug near my elbow, the way he'd positioned the papers with casual precision. Memory rushed in like a draft from an open door. I sat down on the floor, leaning my back against the cabinet, letting the weight of the moment settle. The signature looked exactly as it had then, confident, unshaken, unaware. My thumb traced the indentation of the penstroke, not out of sentimentality, but to acknowledge the distance between then and now. I studied the page longer than necessary, relearning every detail I had once ignored. The language was sterile, the margins tight, the formatting unmistakably official. What had once felt like a harmless favor now held the unmistakable texture of intent. I wanted to believe it had all been a misunderstanding, something clerical, something explainable. But documents don't accidentally acquire notary marks or filing timestamps. They don't migrate themselves into drawers with letters I never wrote. Facts, once examined without emotion, take on their own clarity. I let that clarity wash over me, cool and steady, like stepping into a room lit by fluorescent truth. I flipped the page over and placed it face down on the counter, needing the text out of sight for a moment. The room felt too quiet. I reached over and turned off the desk lamp, letting the natural light fade until the shadows softened along the floor. Sometimes darkness reveals more than brightness does. I stood at the window watching the daylight thin and allowed myself one slow breath. Not grief, not shock, just adjustment. Like realigning a picture frame that's been slightly crooked but tolerable for years. Then I returned to the paper, calmer, more deliberate. At my desk, I photographed the signature with my phone's macro lens, capturing the grooves of the ink and the tiny inconsistencies I hadn't noticed before. I added the images to the ledger, labeling them with the date, time, and location where the document resurfaced. Then I typed a brief line. Verify against county file. The act of recording steadied me more than the discovery itself. Organizing truth made it less fragile, less susceptible to distortion. I closed the folder on my computer and felt a quiet certainty settle into place. The kind that doesn't need drama to be firm. Before the night fully set in, I drafted a short email to a private investigator, whose name the attorney had mentioned. I kept the subject line simple. Inquiry. Discrepancy. No flourish, no emotion. Just the facts needed to open a door. As I hit send, the screen's glow softened across my hands, and the house felt unusually still, as if listening. I didn't feel triumphant or afraid. I felt aligned with something real, something solid. Whatever came next, I was moving toward it with clarity, not hope. The investigator arrived at the cafe 5 minutes early, settling into the corner booth with the ease of someone who has made a career out of being unnoticed. His notebook was a worn slab of leather, softened at the edges, its pages edged with years of quiet observations. When I sat down, he didn't offer small talk. He simply opened the notebook, clicked his pen once, and said, "We'll need to track movement and emergency contacts first." His voice carried a gravelly patience, the kind that didn't rush or reassure. I laid the documents between us, watching his eyes scan every line with a precision that felt almost surgical. He didn't comment on the situation's emotion, only on its structure. He slid a photograph toward me. Captured from a distance but unmistakably clear. My husband standing beside a woman near the campus parking lot. The timestamp in the corner glowed faintly, anchoring the moment in a way that couldn't be softened or rationalized. The angle caught a hint of their conversation, his posture relaxed, hers leaning slightly in. Behind them, the reflection of a license plate shimmered on the car's bumper, which the investigator had circled in red ink. "Routine check," he said, as if this kind of image was as common as a weather report. I studied it longer than necessary, letting every detail settle where it needed to. He closed the notebook halfway and leaned back. "People don't usually lie because they're clever," he said quietly. "They lie because they're afraid of losing something they shouldn't have in the first place." The sentence wasn't meant to provoke. It didn't sag with judgment or sympathy. It simply landed. Flat. Factual, undeniable. I felt its weight more in my ribs than in my chest. Not because it was new, but because hearing it aloud gave shape to something I had sensed for months. I nodded, the kind of nod that acknowledges a truth rather than agrees with it. When the check came, I paid without hesitation, using an account he didn't know about, sliding the receipt into my folder the moment the waiter stepped away. The PDF would join the ledger later, labeled and indexed like everything else. The investigator handed me a small envelope containing additional printouts, parking logs, timestamps, a brief summary of observed patterns. His handwriting was compact, nearly architectural, each letter shaped with clarity. He reminded me to send updates as I uncovered more documents. There was comfort in the structure he offered, quiet, methodical guardrails along a road I was learning to walk alone. By the time I drove home, my face had settled into something neutral, almost serene. I placed my keys on the entry table the way I always did, not giving the silence of the house any more weight than it already held. When he walked in later, I matched his expression with practiced ease. Warm enough to avoid suspicion, distant enough to protect the truth I was carrying. I didn't change my tone, my habits, or my rhythm. Consistency became its own camouflage, a way of moving without drawing attention to the direction. Upstairs, I laid out the investigator's materials beside my ledger and began creating a 3-column comparison chart. Timestamps, location logs, and school-related expenses. The grid formed cleanly, the lines sharp and parallel, the facts falling into place without resistance. I wrote slowly, letting each detail anchor itself. When I finished, I sat back and looked at the completed page, not searching for emotion, only structure. The pattern was emerging, unmistakable and calm. And now, for the first time, I was ready to follow it, wherever it led. I cooked dinner the way I always did, measured movements, quiet routines, the soft clatter of utensils filling the spaces where conversation used to live. The house smelled of rosemary, and something warm drifting out of the oven, a kind of domestic ease that no longer matched the undercurrent running beneath our lives. When he walked in, he smiled with that practiced gentleness that once felt natural and now felt curated. "Thanks for always understanding," he said, placing his bag by the chair as though gratitude alone could bridge the widening gap between us. I nodded, keeping my attention on the simmering pot. Familiarity has a way of disguising fracture, at least for a while. As he stepped toward the table, the porch light outside flickered once, casting a brief pulse across the surface of the countertop. It wasn't dramatic, just a tiny wavering glow, trembling at the edge of visibility before settling again. He didn't notice. I did. The flash stretched his shadow across the kitchen floor, thin and elongated, like something not quite aligned with its source. He set out plates and silverware, humming as if we were a couple moving through a normal weeknight. But the rhythm of his steps didn't match the calm in his voice. It rarely did anymore. While we ate, I counted the flickers in my mind, the way one might count missteps in a dance. 1, 2, 3. He talked about classes, schedules, office hours, things he believed would paint him as dedicated and overwhelmed in all the right ways. I responded with simple nods and the occasional quiet comment, giving him just enough engagement to maintain the illusion he relied on. Each time he paused for reassurance, I offered it lightly, the way someone flips through a familiar script. Underneath it all, though, I was observing the gaps, the pauses too long, the explanations too polished, the ease too intentional. I stood to refill our glasses, the pitcher cool in my hands. When I set his water down, the glass tapped the wooden table with a tone so soft it barely registered. Yet it felt like another small note in a growing composition I hadn't intended to write. He smiled at me in that way he thought appeared vulnerable, almost boyish.
I simply returned to my seat, spooning another bite onto my plate without forcing a smile back. Sometimes neutrality speaks louder than displeasure ever could. He didn't seem to know what to do with it. He tried to ask about my day, but I let my answers remain small, edges trimmed, free of emotional threads he could pull on. The kitchen was warm, but inside I felt cool, clear, steady, observant. I didn't prod him with questions or offer chances for him to elaborate. I didn't give him room for rehearsed narratives. The quiet between us stretched, but instead of feeling strained, it felt intentional, like a boundary quietly rising into place. He sensed something but didn't know its shape, so he let the quiet pass, assuming it would dissipate on its own. When dinner ended, he thanked me again, leaning in as if expecting a familiar softness in return. I didn't offer it. I simply began clearing the dishes, my motions slow, deliberate, unbothered. As I rinsed a plate, I realized the calm I carried wasn't a mask. It was becoming something natural, something earned. Silence no longer felt like retreat, it felt like armor. And as he walked down the hallway humming to himself, I understood that I had finally learned how to stay steady in a house full of shifting stories. The email arrived just after midnight, its notification cutting cleanly through the dark like a thin blade of light. I sat up in bed, the room still and cool, and opened the message from the investigator. Attached was a PDF file with metadata so precise it felt almost clinical. Time of submission, location, device ID. The document showed a declaration of single status, bearing a signature that looked convincingly like mine at first glance. But the more I studied it, the more I recognized the subtle wrongness. The slope slightly steeper, the tail of the final letter too sharp, the pressure uneven. My real signature always carried a steadiness I couldn't unsee. This one tried to imitate confidence and failed. I stared at it until the distinction felt as clear as daylight. I printed 3 copies before the sun came up, feeding each sheet into thick manila envelopes reinforced at the seams. I labeled them carefully, one for my attorney, one for the court, one for my personal records. The printer hummed steadily, its warm breath rising from the output tray as each page slid into view. I sealed the envelopes with a firm press of my thumb, feeling the adhesive catch and hold. Handling them felt strangely empowering, as though the truth, once fragmented, had finally begun to articulate itself. Evidence has a particular weight when gathered deliberately. These pages were no longer abstractions, they were anchors. At my desk, I opened the ledger and began constructing a comparison chart between the forged signature and my verified documents. Columns lined up cleanly. Submission times, notary identifiers, handwriting inconsistencies. I zoomed in on tiny details, stroke thickness, rhythm, pen pressure, observing how forgery reveals itself not through big mistakes, but through small hesitations. The more I studied the chart, the more the pattern crystallized. This wasn't a paperwork mix-up or administrative tangle. It was intentional. It was chosen. And while the realization didn't shock me, it settled into a part of my mind I hadn't allowed to speak before. Now it did. Later that day, he texted me a photo of a new textbook he'd bought, followed by the line, "Don't worry about anything." The message carried a casual lightness, complete with a smiling icon meant to reassure. I stared at the image, his hand holding the book, the background blurred, everything curated to appear earnest. I saved the screenshot, cataloged it, and added its hash to the ledger. His attempts at normalcy no longer tangled with my emotions. They simply became data points, markers in a timeline that no longer matched the one he thought we shared. With each entry I logged, something inside me shifted from reactive to resolved. I didn't feel anger rising or betrayal swelling. Instead, I felt a growing precision, an internal realignment that made room only for what could be proven. I reviewed the PDF again,
letting my eyes trace the mismatched curves of the forged signature. I thought about how much effort it takes to imitate someone's hand, and how easily the truth exposes the attempt. I breathed slowly, the clarity settling into my shoulders like a weight I was finally strong enough to carry. By evening, the evidence sat neatly arranged on my desk: 3 envelopes, a digital ledger, a chart sharp enough to pierce through any pretense. I didn't need to declare anything out loud. The truth had already shaped itself, quiet and unmistakable. As I closed the laptop, the room dimmed into a calm that felt earned. Whatever came next would unfold on a timeline built by fact, not performance. And for the first time, I felt completely aligned with the direction ahead. The courthouse was quieter than I expected that morning, its hallways lined with polished floors that reflected the overhead lights in long, pale streaks. When I reached the clerk's window, I placed my completed petition on the counter with hands that felt steady in a way they hadn't for months. The pen they provided was a simple black ballpoint, the kind meant for forms, not declarations. Still, when I signed my name, the motion felt decisive, clean, uninterrupted, with no hesitation at the edges. The clerk stamped the documents with a firm, rhythmic pressure, and the sound landed with the weight of something irreversible. I didn't step back from the counter. I let the moment settle, letting it become real in my body before I moved. Before I left, I reached into my bag and touched the old document, the one I had once signed under the kitchen light, believing it was just a temporary formality. Its paper felt thinner now, almost flimsy. The meaning I once tied to it had dissolved, leaving only a sheet of legal jargon that no longer carried any emotional claim over me. In contrast, the new filing had a solidness that felt unmistakable. It wasn't born from manipulation or half-truths. It was born from clarity. I folded the old sheet, placed it back into my folder, and let the courthouse's quiet hum wash over me. For the first time, the direction felt entirely in my hands. When I checked the boxes on the petition, I paused at the section on financial transparency. I selected it with deliberate care, marking the line with blue ink that stood out against the grayscale text. I wasn't asking for revenge or punishment. I was asking for accuracy, for a clean separation built on facts rather than fabrications. The checkbox felt symbolic in its own quiet way, an assertion not of anger but of precision. I signed again at the bottom, the pen gliding smoothly, as if acknowledging the steadiness I had grown into. When I handed the completed set back to the clerk, she nodded with neutral efficiency, sliding them into the processing tray without ceremony. That lack of ceremony, oddly, made it feel truer. There was a line on the form for optional remarks, a blank space people often use to spill emotion or justify their reasoning. I left it empty. Emotion didn't belong there. Only the truth did. And the truth was already embedded in the timestamps and signatures. When the clerk handed me the hearing schedule, the paper was still warm from the copier. I held it by the corner, letting its edges cool before tucking it into my folder. I felt no tremor, no sting, just a clean, quiet direction forward. Back home, I opened the small steel lockbox I had purchased weeks earlier. Its hinge creaked softly, unused but ready. I placed the new certified filings inside, smoothing them flat before locking the lid. The metallic click sounded sharper in the room's stillness, like a point marking the end of a sentence. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the quiet fill the space around me. I didn't feel victorious or defeated. I felt aligned. That was enough. I slid the key into the bottom drawer of my nightstand, beside the silver USB that held the digital archive of everything I had gathered. The drawer closed with a soft, deliberate thud, final but not heavy. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to exhale fully, the breath leaving my lungs without resistance. What had once been fear had reorganized itself into clarity. And clarity, I realized, could guide an entire future. I stood, smooth to smooth the blanket on the bed, and walked toward the hallway, with the calm of someone who finally knew the next step. He arrived in the late afternoon, standing in the doorway with his shoulders slightly slumped, holding his keys like they weighed more than they should. "We can fix this," he said before I even invited him inside. His voice carried a tremor he tried to hide beneath a hopeful tone, a tone that once might have softened me. I watched him search my face for an opening, for a remnant of the woman who used to meet his uncertainty with reassurance. The kitchen behind me was warm, the fading sunlight catching the rim of a cooling mug on the counter. I didn't step aside to let him in, I simply waited, letting him feel the distance he had created long before this moment. When I did speak, the words came out steady, almost quiet. "I'm choosing to follow the law," I said, my voice flattening any attempt he might make to reroute the conversation. He blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of it. No anger, no grief, just clarity. He stepped closer, trying to bridge the space between us with the soft familiarity he had always relied on. But I didn't move. My decision wasn't an emotional wave he could redirect. It was a structure now, built, reinforced, unshakable. The silence between us shifted, settling into something factual rather than sentimental. He asked me then, his voice catching slightly, "Do you still love me?" It was the kind of question designed to pull someone back into the old script, to blur lines and soften edges. I didn't answer. Not because I refused the question, but because it didn't belong to the process unfolding. Love, whatever remained or didn't, had no bearing on certified filings, forged signatures, and documented timelines. Instead, I kept my gaze steady on him, letting the absence of a response speak with more precision than any explanation could. He seemed startled by the quiet, as if he had discovered a locked door where an open archway used to be. I handed him a single sheet I had prepared, a short list of minimum terms: financial transparency, reimbursement of funds obtained through misrepresentation, clear separation of accounts. The page held only 3 bullet points, each printed cleanly, each impossible to dismiss as emotional negotiation. He held it between his fingers, staring at it longer than necessary, his breath tightening. The list wasn't punitive, it was structural. He knew it, and the simplicity of it left him with no room to manipulate tone or sympathy. He folded the page once, then again, unable to settle on what to do with it. He didn't argue. He simply let the silence stretch, heavy and uneven, before finally stepping back. His gaze dropped to the floor as if looking for a version of this moment he might still salvage. When he lifted his head, his expression had already changed, something resigned settling behind his eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. I watched him reach for the handle, pausing for a heartbeat that felt like an old reflex, a last attempt to signal something familiar. But he left without looking back. The door clicked shut with an even, muted finality. After he left, I sat at the table and typed a summary of the conversation, sending it to my attorney with a brief factual subject line. No commentary, no adjectives, just documentation.
The email sent with a soft whoosh, disappearing into a trail of digital certainty. The house grew quiet again, but this time it didn't feel hollow. It felt clean, precise. A space no longer occupied by unspoken negotiations or contorted explanations. I closed my laptop and placed my palms flat on the table, steady. Whatever happened next would unfold within boundaries I had drawn. Firm, deliberate, mine. The courtroom felt colder than the hallway, its air filtered and still, carrying the faint scent of old wood and paper handled too many times. My attorney placed the ledger on the table with practiced care, its black cover stark against the pale surface. Tabs in muted colors lined the edge like quiet markers of a long journey. I sat beside him, hands folded, posture straight, letting the gravity of the room settle over my shoulders. When the clerk called the case, the shuffle of papers and the low hum of legal routine created a kind of rhythm, steady, indifferent, unyielding. I felt neither fear nor triumph, only readiness, shaped slowly over months of evidence.
When I spoke, my voice surprised me. It was even, unshaken. Each detail delivered with clarity stripped of emotion. I read the timestamps, the communication logs, the documented discrepancies, careful to stick to facts and nothing beyond them. The room didn't react, it absorbed. The judge took notes quietly, her pen tapping the page in small, deliberate beats. My attorney nodded subtly beside me, signaling that my steadiness held. I didn't look at my husband. I kept my gaze on the documents, anchoring myself to what was verifiable, not to what once felt familiar. Above us, the fluorescent lights reflected faintly against my attorney's glasses, creating a thin gleam across the lenses that mirrored the courtroom's austere order. It lent the moment an almost clinical clarity, as though the truth itself were being illuminated without sentiment. The judge leaned forward slightly, scanning the sequence of exhibits laid before her. I watched her eyes move from page to page, seeing how the timeline formed its own argument without requiring embellishment. The quiet in the room sharpened, turning into a space where intention and impact had nowhere to hide. His attorney presented his explanation next, framing it as confusion, clerical error, misunderstanding. The words floated harmlessly in the air but landed nowhere. The judge asked a simple question: where is the evidence of the mistake? The silence that followed stretched thin, taut like a wire under strain. He shifted in his seat, fingers tightening around the edge of his folder. His lawyer tried to fill the void with polished phrases, but each one felt more hollow than the last. The facts didn't bend. They remained exactly as I had laid them out. When it was my turn again, I submitted the audio file and the certified PDF, placing the silver USB on the small tray the bailiff held out. The motion was precise, almost ceremonial, yet I felt detached from the symbolism. This wasn't vengeance, it was verification. The judge examined the exhibits briefly, then handed them to the clerk. My breathing stayed steady, my hands still. Whatever personal history lingered between us had no seat in this room. Only the documented truth did, and it flowed forward in a clear, uninterrupted line. 2 seconds of silence followed, so quiet the hum of the overhead lights became almost audible. It wasn't awkward or dramatic. It was decisive, the kind of silence that naturally fills a room where the facts have already spoken. I lowered my eyes to the table, not in defeat but in acknowledgement of the moment settling into place. The judge adjusted her glasses and continued with the proceedings. And as the rhythm of the courtroom resumed, I realized something had shifted. Not around me, but within me. The truth was no longer something I carried alone.
He tried to frame everything in softer terms when he finally spoke again. Words like family and misunderstanding drifted from his side of the courtroom, as if invoking sentiment could dilute the precision of the evidence. He mentioned our history, our years together, the pressures he'd been under. I kept my gaze low, studying the polish on the wooden table, letting my eyes rest on the faint scratches where other stories had likely unfolded. None of what he said angered me. It barely reached me. His reasoning felt like a thin sheet held up against a storm, flapping, fragile, unable to shield anything. I let the judge absorb his words while I conserved my silence. Some truths don't need to compete with noise. The judge responded with an even, unhurried tone. "The errors described are not small," she said, tapping her pen twice in a controlled, deliberate rhythm. The sound echoed lightly in the room, a subtle punctuation mark. I could sense him flinch, not visibly but in the slight tension that pulled at his shoulders. His attorney glanced at him, perhaps searching for a pivot that wasn't there. Standing beside my own counsel,
I felt the difference between narrative and structure, between intention and documentation. The judge's words didn't feel harsh. They felt precise. And precision, I was learning, held more weight than emotion ever could in a room like this. I kept my attention on the documents as the judge asked for clarifications. I didn't look at him. Not out of coldness, but out of understanding. The moment wasn't about us as people anymore. It was about the truth we had each placed on the record. My attorney pointed to sections of the ledger, highlighting dates and metadata that aligned like rungs on a ladder. Each fact reinforced the one before it, forming a structure impossible to step around. I breathed slowly, grounding myself in the certainty that none of this required passion, only clarity.
I felt the quiet strength of knowing I had shown up with accuracy, not accusation. He grew tangled in his own explanations, weaving between statements that contradicted earlier ones. His voice accelerated, then softened, then stumbled. The judge's expression remained neutral, but her questions did not. Each one narrowed the space he had to maneuver, pushing him toward the corner he had built himself. His attorney scribbled notes while the contradictions stacked visibly in the air between them. It wasn't vindication I felt, it was distance, a widening that no apology or justification could bridge. Watching him speak felt like watching someone try to steady a structure already leaning too far to be saved. A moment passed, when he finally fell silent, hands clasped together, jaw tight. The judge requested supplemental financial documents within a strict timeline, her voice firm but not unkind. The order struck the air with quiet authority, settling into place like a stone dropped into water. Ripples of consequence followed instantly. I nodded when the judge's eyes briefly shifted toward me, acknowledging the instruction. I didn't need to say anything. The process was moving forward with or without my voice. I felt an unexpected steadiness in that, like stepping onto solid ground after months of uncertainty. As the judge adjourned the session, the room exhaled. Papers were gathered, chairs shifted, footsteps began to scatter. I remained seated for a moment, letting the stillness pass through me. What had just unfolded wasn't a victory. It was a clarification, a correction. I stood slowly, closing the ledger as though sealing a chapter rather than ending a battle. My attorney touched my arm gently, guiding me toward the aisle. I walked out without looking back at him, not out of defiance, but because the moment behind me no longer required my attention. When we moved into the administrative phase, everything shifted from emotion to precision. My attorney explained the next steps in a calm, measured voice. Asset separation, account disclosures, a series of forms designed not to punish but to clarify. I agreed to a division plan that favored transparency over retaliation. It felt almost strange, choosing restraint when so much damage had been done. But anger didn't seem like the right architect for the future. I wanted the structure clean, fair, and indisputable. As I signed the first set of procedural documents, I felt a quiet sense of alignment, as if I were choosing the version of myself I wanted to carry forward. The printer in the clerk's office worked steadily, releasing sheets of official paperwork in a soft mechanical rhythm. Each page bore the courthouse crest, stamped sharply at the top. The ink was a deep, unwavering black, drying almost instantly on the thick paper. I waited with my hands folded, watching the clerk stack the documents in a neat pile. The sound of the machine, steady, unfaltering, felt like a counterpoint to the chaos of the past months. When she handed me the stack, the weight of it settled into my palms like a ledger closing. The edges were crisp, the corners unbent, the language precise. I signed where they indicated, not glancing toward the empty seat to my left where he would have once sat. The act of signing felt different now, less like an obligation, more like an affirmation of boundaries I had carved with careful hands. My pen moved in a straight, uninterrupted line,
the ink flowing evenly across the page. There was no tremor, no hesitation waiting to rise beneath my skin. The document wasn't a symbol of loss. It was a map, marking where I stood and where I was going. When I finished, I capped the pen quietly, feeling an unexpected steadiness settle inside me. The court officer filed the documents with an efficient nod, sliding them into a labeled tray before turning to acknowledge the next case. His tone was neutral, his movements practiced, his presence a reminder that these moments, once monumental to me, were routine to the system that processed them. Somehow the ordinariness of it felt grounding. There was no drama, no echoing declaration, just a simple acknowledgement. This part is complete. I breathed out slowly, letting the simplicity of the statement settle. It felt cleaner than any emotional closure I might have imagined. My attorney gathered her notes, explaining gently what remained, mostly administrative tasks now, timelines, confirmations, signatures that would formalize the boundaries already drawn in practice. I nodded, absorbing each step with a sense of calm I wouldn't have thought possible months earlier. "From here on, it's mostly paperwork," she said. And there was something reassuring in the practicality of it. Paperwork I could handle. Paperwork didn't lie. Paperwork didn't bend itself into shapes meant to confuse. We stood, and she offered a small, steady smile before we walked down the corridor together. Outside the courtroom, we parted ways in opposite directions, each step echoing lightly across the polished floor. I didn't look behind me. I didn't need to. The phase we had just concluded was behind glass now, preserved, documented, contained. As I pushed through the heavy door leading back into the main hall, a sense of quiet resolution pressed gently against my ribs. The path ahead wasn't marked by triumph or sorrow. It was marked by order. And order, I realized, was the first real kindness I had offered myself in a long time. In the courthouse lobby, I paused beneath the high ceiling, where soft afternoon light filtered through tall windows. I opened the final document the clerk had handed me and let the pages unfold gently in my hands. The paper caught the light for a moment, just a subtle gleam sliding across the surface before settling into a muted glow. I traced a fingertip along the printed lines, not to reread them, but to acknowledge the shift they represented. No fear rose in me. No tremor hid beneath my skin. It was strange, almost relieving, to realize the document no longer felt like a verdict hanging over me. It felt like confirmation of a path chosen, of clarity earned, of boundaries set with purpose rather than bitterness. He walked past me then, close enough that I could feel the lingering warmth of his presence, but distant enough that neither of us pretended to reach out. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. We weren't spouses making eye contact across a difficult moment. We were two individuals concluding separate tasks in the same building. The detachment wasn't harsh. It was clean, simple, a recognition of what had already been undone long before the paperwork made it official. For a moment, I watched his reflection in the glass door as he exited, the image shrinking until the frame reclaimed its stillness. There was no sting in the sight, only a quiet certainty that our paths no longer intersected. I allowed myself a small smile, not triumphant, not nostalgic, but something lighter, like loosening a tight knot that had pressed against my ribs for too long. I rested the folded document against my palm and turned toward the administrative wing. There, I submitted a certified copy to the university office, including the portion relevant to their aid decisions. The staff member accepted it with professional courtesy, scanning the barcode before placing it in a tray marked Processing. I thanked her and stepped back, watching the envelope settle into its place. It struck me how unremarkable the moment was, despite everything it represented. That ordinariness felt like a gift. On a nearby bench, I paused to photograph the envelope resting on the tray, framing the image with care before adding it to my ledger. The timestamp blinked softly on my phone screen. One more quiet entry in a long trail of documentation. I tagged the file and saved it, feeling the familiar steadiness of order. In the photo, the envelope looked small, almost delicate, yet I knew its contents carried months of truth arranged in clean lines and official stamps. I closed my phone and placed it in my bag, feeling the weight of the moment, not heavy, but measured, balanced, earned. Outside, the air was cool and steady. I stepped onto the wide concrete landing, letting the sounds of distant traffic replace the courtroom's structured quiet. For a moment, I stood there with my hands resting lightly on the strap of my bag, absorbing the sense of completion taking shape around me. No dramatic realization arrived, no wave of emotion rose to meet me. Instead, there was a calm, almost clinical recognition that a chapter had shifted from active to archived. I inhaled slowly, letting the clarity settle deeper, grounding me in the present rather than what had come before. When I walked away from the building, there was no need for a final glance over my shoulder. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a soft, measured thud, and the world ahead opened with quiet precision. I felt neither triumphant nor defeated, just aligned with the truth I had spent months assembling, piece by piece. The sky above held no signs of storm or celebration. It was simply clear. And that clarity, steady and unadorned, was enough to guide my next step forward. Packing the old files felt less like sorting through a past life and more like completing a meticulous inventory. I knelt on the living room floor, lifting each folder from the cabinet and placing it into a box labeled "Completed." The sound of packing tape tearing across the cardboard echoed softly through the room, crisp and deliberate. Nothing inside those folders surprised me anymore. Receipts, statements, forms that once held emotional weight now felt like neutral artifacts. With each document I placed into the box, something settled inside me. Not closure exactly, something quieter. A recognition that the story they told had already concluded, long before the pages found their way into storage. The next task was practical. I opened an account solely in my name, removing his from every financial thread that had once bound us. The bank representative printed a confirmation slip with a faint scent of warm ink, handing it to me with a smile touched by professional courtesy rather than curiosity. I reviewed the details: my name, my number, my signature standing alone. It felt clean, necessary. I slipped the slip into my folder, noticing how calm my hands were. This wasn't an act of severing. It was an act of reclaiming. A quiet correction to something that had drifted too far from center. Then came the list of shared accounts, utilities, subscriptions, automatic payments. I moved through them slowly, striking his name from each one, resetting passwords, removing linked cards. It was tedious work, but methodical in a way that soothed me. Every deletion felt like clearing a corner of a room long cluttered. Some accounts asked for security questions, and I chose answers that held no ties to anniversaries or sentimental dates. Neutral details only I would know. With every confirmation email that arrived, saying, "Your changes have been updated," I felt another thin thread loosen. When I stepped into my new place, the hallway light flicked on with a steady golden glow. No flicker, no hesitation. I stood beneath it for a moment, letting the warmth rest on my shoulders. The space was small, quiet, uncluttered. The absence of someone else's presence wasn't lonely. It was spacious. I set my back down on the floorboards, listening to the soft echo as it met the wood. For the first time in months, there was no need to measure my reactions, no need to anticipate someone else's explanations. The air felt uncomplicated, almost clean. I hung my keys on the small wooden hook beside the door, the clink of metal against wood sounding strangely final yet gentle. The apartment felt like a blank page, but not in the overwhelming sense, more like a page waiting for handwriting I wasn't rushing to put down. I took a slow tour of the rooms, noting the angle of the light, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet settling of the walls. Each detail felt like a subtle reassurance that this was mine, shaped by no one's agenda but my own. Later, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. Peace is a document you sign with yourself. I didn't overthink it. The words had arrived quietly, the way new truths often do. I set the notebook aside and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, letting my eyes adjust to the stillness. Nothing dramatic waited for me here, only a steady, honest calm. And for the first time in a long while, that was exactly what I wanted. The email from the university arrived early in the morning, its subject line stark and procedural. Compliance request. I read it twice, letting the meaning settle. They were initiating repayment for the aid he had obtained under false pretenses, and they needed documentation to move forward. There was no accusation in their tone, just the firm, clean neutrality of an institution correcting a discrepancy. I drafted a short response, attaching the court decision and the summary of the timeline. My fingers moved calmly over the keyboard, each click a quiet acknowledgement of the truth finally aligning in the right direction. When I hit send, the room remained still, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the air felt clearer. Their reply came quickly. The staff member thanked me for providing detailed records and confirmed that the process was underway. The message was brief, polite, almost understated. I appreciated its simplicity. It reminded me that consequences don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they unfold through quiet channels, guided by systems rather than emotion. I saved the email thread into my ledger, labeling the folder with the precision I had grown accustomed to. There was no satisfaction in the exchange, only the steady sense of something being corrected. It was a return, not a victory. I printed the correspondence and added it to my physical file, slipping each page into a clear sleeve. The crisp plastic edges clicked lightly as they settled into the binder. My handwriting marked the margins with dates and cross-references, each line neat and controlled. I had come to appreciate this order, the way facts could be arranged like stepping stones. Filing everything didn't feel obsessive or defensive anymore. It felt like stewardship, of truth, of my future, of the quiet structure I had built after months of unraveling. I placed the binder on the shelf, its spine aligned with the rest. When I responded to the university's final request for confirmation, I wrote only what was needed. No narrative, no explanation beyond the documents themselves. I kept my tone as neutral as theirs. I realized, somewhere in the middle of typing, that I no longer felt compelled to justify anything. Facts didn't require justification. They required clarity. And clarity was something I could offer without strain. I clicked send again, watching the message disappear from the screen with a soft sweep of pixels. A small part of me felt lighter, as though I had finally completed a task that had been waiting in the background of my mind. Before closing my laptop, I opened the folder labeled 017 in my digital ledger. I reviewed everything: emails, PDFs, timestamps, allowing the clean arrangement to confirm for me what I already knew. This chapter was nearly closed. I didn't feel anger toward him anymore, not even disappointment. Just distance. The kind that arrives when the truth has fully replaced whatever story you were once told. I logged the final entry with a quiet exhale, the keystrokes soft in the stillness of the room. I folded the printed documents once more and placed them into the sleeve, sliding the binder shut with a muted thump.
That sound, controlled, final, even, felt like the closing of a door that had been left ajar for too long. I rested my hand on the cover for a moment, not out of sentiment but acknowledgement. Then I stood, put the binder back on the shelf and let the room return to its soft rhythm. This portion of the process was done, and I could feel space opening for what came next. The notice arrived in a plain envelope, its language clipped and administrative. I was requested to appear as a witness in an internal investigation regarding the misuse of aid. I arrived on time, stepping into a building that felt both impersonal and strangely familiar. Another place where truth was cataloged, not dramatized. The waiting room hummed with fluorescent lights, casting everything in a muted tone that softened the edges of the moment. When they called my name, I followed an officer down a narrow hallway into a small interview room. The chair was metal, the table laminate, the atmosphere steady. I placed my folder on the surface, opened it calmly, and waited for the questions to come. The investigator across from me asked only for the facts. No commentary, no interpretation. Just the linear sequence of what had occurred. I responded the same way, measured, direct, speaking only to what I had documented. There was a certain relief in that structure, as though each answer slid neatly into the right place on an invisible grid. He nodded occasionally, marking notes in a quiet, steady rhythm. My voice didn't waver, my breathing remained even. I wasn't there to correct him or to accuse anyone. I was there to verify a timeline that had already been quietly forming for months. At one point, he looked up from his notes and asked, "Is there anything else you want to add?" His tone wasn't fishing for emotion, just offering procedural completeness. I shook my head. "No," I said. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said was already on paper, time-stamped, verified. Emotion didn't belong in that room. It would have only cluttered the clarity. He accepted the answer with a small nod and returned to his writing. The silence felt clean, not awkward. Two people aligned with the same objective truth. When the interview concluded, I gathered my documents and stood. The door clicked shut behind me with a soft metallic sound, allowing the hallway's cooler air to settle over my shoulders. I didn't feel drained or shaken. Instead, I felt unexpectedly grounded. The process had unfolded without conflict, without the volatility I once feared. It was simply a sequence of confirmations, each aligning with the next. As I walked toward the building's exit, my footsteps echoed faintly against the tile floor. Steady, measured, familiar. In the hallway, I paused beside a long window overlooking a quiet courtyard. The trees outside barely moved, their leaves holding still in the late morning light. I found myself standing straighter than usual, my spine aligned, shoulders relaxed. There was no need to lean against the wall, no instinct to steady myself. For months I had expected moments like this to feel heavy, as though truth carried its own physical weight. Instead, it felt clarifying. The distance between what had happened and what I had once believed no longer felt jagged. It felt resolved. As I stepped out of the building, the door closed behind me with a soft finality. I didn't need him to fail or fall or face some dramatic reckoning. That had never been the point. I only needed the truth to settle into place, so I could move on without uncertainty pulling at me. The investigation wasn't the end. It was simply another confirmation. And walking across the quiet parking lot, I realized
I no longer needed anything from the past to make sense. I needed only what came next. A friend asked me over coffee, "Aren't you angry?" The question hovered between us, warm steam rising from her cup as though expecting an answer shaped by fire. I felt a small, quiet smile form, not performative, not evasive. "I'm busy living honestly," I replied. And it was true. Anger once felt like an inevitable destination, something I thought I'd eventually arrive at. Instead, it had passed by without anchoring itself in me. I had filled my days with real tasks, real decisions, real clarity. There was no space left for emotions that distorted more than they revealed. My friend studied my face, perhaps searching for hidden heat. But there was none. Only steadiness, practiced and earned. Later, at home, I made tea and sat beside the window where the afternoon light thinned into a soft gold. The steam curled gently upward, blurring the edges of the glass for a moment before fading. I watched the quiet street outside, cars passing, branches shifting slightly in the breeze, the ordinary rhythm of a world that hadn't paused for my life's upheaval. The stillness of the moment felt like an anchor rather than an emptiness. I lifted the cup, inhaling its warmth. There was nothing dramatic about the scene, nothing symbolic. Just peace, simple and unadorned, settling into the space that chaos once occupied. A memory from our wedding day surfaced, unbidden but gentle. The image of us signing documents, laughing lightly, believing that those signatures were the beginning of something steady. It felt distant now, like watching two strangers make promises with the best intentions but limited foresight. I didn't flinch from the memory. I didn't try to rewrite it or mourn it. I simply let it exist, the way one acknowledges a chapter that served its purpose before ending. I sipped my tea and let the warmth sit in my chest, no longer tied to nostalgia or loss, just a reminder that beginnings don't predict outcomes. I placed the cup down and let a long breath move through me, unforced, unweighted. There was no need to justify my decisions to myself anymore. The narrative he had once shaped around us no longer reached me.
I didn't need to raise a metaphorical glass of judgment in his direction, nor did I feel compelled to revisit every moment leading to our unraveling. The clarity I had gained was not sharp or cutting. It was calm, like a tide that had finally found its natural level. With each breath, the room felt more like home, not because it was new, but because it was honest. I sent a message to myself, a habit I'd developed when I wanted to mark a shift internally rather than externally. "Stay transparent," I typed. A simple statement, but one that carried the philosophy I had grown into. Truth as a discipline, not a weapon. I saved it in a folder separate from everything else, not mixing it with evidence or records. This wasn't documentation, it was intention. A quiet promise to keep choosing clarity over distortion, even when the choices became easier, even when no one else was watching. Peace doesn't announce itself, but it makes space where tension once lived. Sitting there, with the cup cooling beside me and the window catching the very last thread of daylight, I felt that peace take root. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was steady, like something that had been waiting patiently for me to arrive. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle fully around me. When I opened them again, the world looked unchanged, but I wasn't. And that difference was enough. I spent the morning going through the last remnants of our shared accounts, the ones that had lingered because they were easy to forget. Store memberships, old auto-pay settings, a joint savings account we hadn't touched in months. I moved through each item systematically, the cursor gliding across the screen as I unchecked boxes, closed profiles, and ended authorizations.
Some accounts required confirmation codes, others needed written requests. The rhythm was steady. Review, update, confirm. When I finally reached the last joint account,
A quiet green check mark appeared beside the line reading, "Closed." I stared at it for a moment, feeling not triumph, but completion. A small, necessary closing of a door. Next came the logins, passwords I had shared once without hesitation, back when transparency was assumed rather than protected. I changed each one with measured patience, selecting combinations that held no sentimental markers or familiar sequences. The process was mundane on the surface, but underneath it carried a slow, grounding steadiness. Two-factor verification prompts appeared on my phone, stacking themselves like small assurances. "Your settings have been updated," each message read. I didn't screenshot them anymore. I didn't need to. The updates weren't evidence. They were boundaries. I went through my emergency contacts, removing his name from the list that once assumed we would always be each other's first call. The form fields felt strangely empty afterward, yet not in a way that stung. Instead, the blank spaces felt accurate, reflecting a reality that had shifted, quietly but irrevocably. I added my own name where the system required a primary contact, acknowledging a responsibility I no longer felt compelled to share. It wasn't loneliness, it was autonomy. A calm reassurance that I could be the one to answer my own emergencies. When I checked the beneficiaries on my pension and insurance accounts, I found his name still listed, a leftover from a time when the future had felt shared and predictable. The removal process was simple, just a form, a signature, a confirmation. But the emotional rhythm beneath it was gentler than I expected. No bitterness, no dramatic pause, just correction. The clerk emailed me a confirmation receipt, the kind with clean formatting and a stamped header. I filed it neatly, appreciating the quiet precision of the update. It felt like setting a bone straight after it had healed wrong for too long. I logged into our old cloud storage, navigating through folders full of photos, documents, and half-forgotten projects. I downloaded what belonged to me, clean copies, no duplicates, before revoking his access entirely. The system asked, "Are you sure?" I clicked yes, without hesitation. The action felt neither symbolic nor emotional. It was simply accurate. When the notification appeared saying, "User removed," I watched it fade from the corner of the screen, leaving the interface clearer. There was something reassuring about the simplicity of digital endings. They didn't linger. They didn't argue. After finishing, I printed a final summary and placed it into a folder labeled Post-Decree, sliding it onto the shelf beside the rest of the documentation. The spine aligned easily, fitting into the quiet order I had built, piece by piece. As I closed the cabinet, the soft click felt measured and final. Without being heavy, I stood for a moment, letting the clarity of it settle into my shoulders. Financially, administratively, structurally, we were now separate, and the separation felt not like loss, but like the clean air that follows a long storm. At the clerk's counter, the name change form lay in front of me like a quiet invitation. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes and a neatly pinned badge, reviewed my paperwork with steady professionalism. When she reached the confirmation page, she looked up and offered a small smile. "Congratulations," she said. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, just softly, like someone acknowledging a step taken with intention. I signed the document, letting my old last name settle back into place with a sense of alignment I hadn't expected. My handwriting looked calm, almost serene, as if it recognized the return before I consciously did. When the clerk stamped the form, the sound was gentle but gentle, a clean punctuation mark. On the drive home, I rolled the window down,
letting the light breeze wash through the car. It carried the faint scent of soap from a nearby laundromat and something fresh from the early afternoon air. I realized how long it had been since I let myself breathe without thinking about what came next. The road stretched evenly ahead of me, traffic unhurried. I messaged my attorney to confirm the update. Her red receipt appeared almost instantly, a small green dot blinking into existence. I didn't need her to respond with reassurance. The acknowledgement alone felt like enough structure for the moment. When I reached home, I took out the small metal nameplate I'd kept tucked away for months, a simple plaque with raised lettering, understated and clear. I held it in my palm for a moment, feeling the cool metal warm slowly against my skin. Then I walked to the front door and positioned it carefully above the old screw holes. The letters aligned cleanly, like they had been waiting for the surface to be ready again. I tightened the screws, stood back, and let my eyes rest on the name I had reclaimed. It didn't feel like going backward. It felt like stepping into something restored. Not old, not new, just right. Inside, I placed the final official document into the archive box, a smooth folder containing only the last required confirmations. I closed the lid gently, letting it fall into place without resistance. The sound carried the kind of soft finality that marks the end of something fully processed rather than abruptly severed. The box no longer felt heavy. It felt complete. I slid it to the back of the shelf and let the cabinet door close slowly. There was no lingering hesitation, no second glance. Everything that needed to be documented had been. I walked into the kitchen, where the late afternoon light stretched across the counters in long, steady lines. I turned on the overhead lamp, expecting the familiar flicker, but it held. A steady warmth filled the room, gentle and patient, settling over the clean dishes and the quiet surfaces.
I stood there for a moment, just absorbing the stillness. Nothing dramatic was unfolding. Nothing demanded my immediate attention. The space felt honest. My name felt mine. My life felt aligned with itself in a way I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. I leaned against the doorframe, letting the room breathe around me. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Of choices made, boundaries held, truths honored. I didn't think about him, or what he might be doing, or what he might say if he saw this moment. His narrative no longer reached the edges of my life. This space, this name, this calm, they were mine alone. I exhaled slowly, letting the air move cleanly through me. Another step was done, and the life ahead felt not new, but fully inhabited. Morning light eased into the hallway, soft and unhurried, falling across the floor in a warm, even sheet. When I opened the small steel cabinet, the beam slipped inside and rested directly on the stack of neatly filed documents. The glow caught the edges of the papers, giving them a quiet presence that felt very different from the first time I had encountered forms like these. Back then, every sheet had felt heavy, coated with uncertainty and hidden intentions. Now, the same light that once exposed fear simply revealed order. I stood there for a moment, letting the brightness settle over my hands as if acknowledging the final shape of everything I'd carried. I reached into the cabinet and lifted the final certified document, the one that had traveled with me through courthouse lines, administrative counters, and months of careful truth-telling. Its texture felt familiar now, the paper thick and cool, the embossed seal catching against my thumb. It no longer felt like a wedge between two people, or the remnant of a broken narrative. It felt like something reclaimed, something that had found its way back to the person who should have held it from the beginning. As I stood in the doorway with the document in my hand, I realized it held no emotional sting anymore. Only clarity. Only my name. Only truth. I placed it gently inside the permanent completed folder, sliding it between the other documents that had already been sorted and sealed. The folder closed smoothly, without resistance, as though it understood its own purpose.
I pressed along the top edge to secure it, then returned it to the cabinet. The structure of the shelf, simple, metal, unadorned, felt like the right home for something that had undergone so many shifts in meaning. This wasn't an ending built on anger or vindication. It was an ending built on precision, on calm, on the quiet relief of everything being exactly where it belonged. When I locked the cabinet, the latch clicked into place with a soft, decisive sound. Not sharp, not dramatic, just final. The kind of finality that doesn't slam doors but closes them gently, firmly, with full awareness. I rested my hand on the metal for a moment, feeling its cool surface under my palm. There was no tension left in me. No lingering question about whether I had missed something or overlooked a detail. Every step had been deliberate. Every fact had been given its place. The lock wasn't just securing paperwork, it was securing certainty. I walked back to the kitchen, the soft morning light reaching into the room before I did. I poured myself another cup of tea, watching the steam unfurl into the air like a slow exhale. My hands felt steady, the kind of steadiness that comes not from avoiding difficulty, but from moving through it deliberately. I sat at the table, letting the warmth of the cup rest against my palms, and looked around the quiet space that now reflected only my choices. The light settled across the surface of the table, steady and warm, illuminating nothing hidden, only what was real. I breathed in, slow and even, recognizing the feeling that had replaced fear, confusion, and doubt. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't closure in the dramatic sense. It was something simpler, cleaner, ownership. Of my name, my life, my direction. He had fabricated papers once, hoping they would shape my reality without my consent. Now, the only paper that mattered was the one I had filed myself. Deliberately, clearly, truthfully. I lifted my cup, took a small sip, and let the calm settle fully. The story was mine again. In the end, it wasn't the court stamp or the sealed envelope that stayed with me. It was the quiet morning after, when the house finally felt aligned with my breathing again. No tension hiding in the walls. No shadows shaped like old fears. Just light, steady and uncomplicated. Settling over a life I had rebuilt detail by detail, truth by truth. I realized then that closure isn't a door slamming shut. It's a room growing quiet. It's a name returned. It's the moment you open a cabinet full of documents and feel no tremor in your hands, only recognition. I chose this path. I walked every step, and I am standing exactly where I meant to be. He forged the papers once. I lived the truth. And now the truth lives with me, calm, precise, entirely mine. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If this journey stirred something in you, or reminded you of your own strength, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, emotional, and deeply human, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.